backhaul track. We're going to have three panels today focusing on first small cell backhaul, second macro site backhaul, and then a third panel on financing backhaul builds and fiber infrastructure. So it should be a riveting couple of hours with some good discussion, hopefully. And we look forward to your questions throughout the sessions. Just as a preface, thinking about the industry, with consulting firm ATLANTIC-ACM, we're a strategy consulting and advisory firm that works in the telecom space. When we think about this space in the U.S. and look at cell site growth and potential cell site growth that will drive the backhaul space, we see an immense amount of long-term growth in the small cell arena as well as continued expansion in the macro arena. But obviously the big question is how big will non-macro site deployments be and how much backhaul opportunity will that drive? This is a pretty aggressive forecast here that has non-macro sites growing by 10x over the next 5 years. That would obviously be a pretty big number, but if that comes true, there will obviously be a significant amount of backhaul demand from all types of technologies on a go-forward basis. When we think about the backhaul space, we've seen the amount of capacity needed at a given cell site rise rapidly over the past 4 years. We started when LTE was first launched. You think about the average site was generally connected by a bunch of T1s, sub 20 megs per site. With LTE beginning to launch, you saw Ethernet to the cell on the lit services side take over. And by 2014, we're seeing Ethernet as the dominant technology for backhaul in the US on average macro site at around an average of 130 megs per site. And we expect that to continue to grow pretty rapidly in scale as user demand continues to rise rapidly. I think if you look at Cisco's forecasts in the space, we see a significant amount of growth in usage driving demand for more capacity at cell sites. So in today's sessions, we'll get a couple of key themes discussed. The first being small cell, or what we like to say in our business, sort of non-macro site expansion. Could be ODAS, could be DAS with remote radio heads, it could be CRAN driven, it could be also just pure small cell. So when is that going to happen? How will it occur? What will the Backhaul Solutions driving in its enablement? Small cell is what we think a necessary, or non-macro site deployments is a necessary move for the industry as it really makes spectrum usage more efficient. But it's a question of how and when at this point. On the other side of things, there's a constant juggling of network costs versus quality. And this is what end user operators or end user service providers are facing this discussion on a daily basis today, as we've seen industry ARPUs drop on a user basis significantly, as there's been a significant amount of pricing pressure in the space over the last year. And with that comes pressures on the cost line items and capital expenditures of all operators. So how do you efficiently deploy a high quality user experience is a key question we believe today. And then finally, fiber's future. There's been a heavy amount of network investment to expand fiber connectivity. Really with the drive of LTE, we saw fiber brought to a huge number of towers over the last 5 to 7 years. And it's driven a significant amount of investment in the space, new builds, consolidation of operators. What's the future there? As we've seen the space rapidly consolidate, we've seen tower providers enter and acquire entities in the space. We've seen a number of financings occur and a large amount of M&A occur. So the third panel will discuss fiber's future, backhaul's future, and the future of the infrastructure market. So with that, we'll get started with the small cell backhaul panel. So today we have a esteemed panel here of both fiber providers, tower service providers, as well as equipment vendors and consultants as well. So we're going to discuss small cell backhaul solutions for you, and I think we'll start by each participant giving a brief introduction about themselves, their company, and their role in the backhaul world.
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome everyone. My name is Jeremy Vai, and I'm with Cox Business. I'm the National Vice President for Carrier, and Cox has been in the wireless backhaul business. Really, when I thought back on it, we're coming up on 2 decades, which is pretty amazing, starting with T1s to the bandwidths that we're serving today. We're grown quite a bit with our M&O customers and seen the demands change quite a bit, and we've also had to move the services that we deliver for our carriers, and we look forward to kind of the continued growth in the small cell area as well.
Steve?
My name is Steve Sifferman. I'm the president and CEO of Tarana Wireless. We're a Silicon Valley-based manufacturer of wireless backhaul equipment. Our main focus to date has been in the area of small cell backhaul, fiber extension, backhaul for macro cells that cannot get either fiber or traditional microwave there. We have basically launched our platform this year. We're commercial in a few European countries. We're commercial in South America and doing some work here in the United States.
Thanks. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Piekarski, Vice President of Product Management and Development for small cells at Crown Castle. I've been in the business for over 32 years and been with Crown Castle now 10 as a result of the NextG acquisition, which happened 3 years ago. Crown Castle, as you probably know, is it as a tower company. We do have 40,000 towers, but with the recent Synesis acquisition, we also have 17,000 miles of dark fiber. We view that fiber much like a horizontal tower. In other words, it's an asset for us, and we place small cells in the right of way on that asset using that fiber as part of backhaul or fronthaul. We also have about 14,000 sites already deployed, a couple thousand under construction, small cells using the definition that Aaron touched on earlier, and we have access to about 30,000 rooftops through various agreements that we have.
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Jones, Senior Vice President of Mobile Infrastructure at Zayo. Zayo is a global provider of transport infrastructure. We provide lit services, dark services, co-location, and interconnection. We run a network of about 84,000 route miles, mostly in the United States as well as the UK and France. A good portion of that network is in metropolitan areas. We have very dense networks in a number of metro areas around the country. We've been around since 2007, have done a lot of acquisitions. We've acquired about 34 companies during the last 8 years and are growing extensively organically as well.
Good afternoon. My name is Shaun Cohen. I'm with Vertix Consulting, and we are primarily serve the wireless space, right? So we work with both vendors and carriers. Currently, we're doing some work with a carrier on their small cell deployment plan, and it's very interesting to see somebody make really big plans in this space, and maybe that will drive some change and some cost reduction, and finally see a large-scale small cell deployment.
Sounds good. Thank you. So let's start with a definition discussion. We do a lot of talks on sort of small cell and what the broad term small cell means. It means a lot of different things to a lot of people. So I'd like to just work down the panelists and have them each define, what small cell means to them, what it encompasses from their business's perspective as far as what's being deployed.
Thanks, Aaron. I think the description that you gave earlier was actually quite good. It's almost, and it depends on the carrier, I think, but everything that's an alternate solution to a macro tower starts to fit the mold. Whether it's traditional DAS, if it's true small cell, or even into the CRAN spectrum, I think all of those alternate solutions start to fit kind of anything that's not a macro starts to fit into that definition. I think the needs vary greatly when you start to get into what are the solutions you need, Fronthaul versus backhaul, combinations of those, infrastructure to support all of those. I think co-location and some of the other pieces start to become more important in the transport delivery of CRAN and things like that. But I think you're right, it's really a bundle of solutions versus just one or another technology.
You know, the only thing I'd add to this is, in some instances, I'd qualify Wi-Fi as a small cell architecture. You see it from some of the competitive carriers rolling out commercial Wi-Fi that is meant to augment additional capacity. And some of the deployments we have are, in fact, providing backhaul to Wi-Fi access points. Other than that, I think, as you said, I think anything that's non-macro based, either indoor or outdoor, would be my definition.
Building on what the other speaker said, we agree, as we say, we Crown Castle, that small cells come in various flavors as far as the market is concerned. Basically, what we're talking about is a coverage solution that's limited to a very specific area to either provide capacity or coverage where the macro isn't providing coverage. Those solutions could be a variety of equipment, remote radio units connected back to a baseband unit. They're operating at low power or even higher power, as one example. You could have a DAS, as people have mentioned, and the true definition technically of a small cell is something that's operating something in the 10 watts or below range and is a cell. In other words, it has its own transceiver and baseband unit, just like a macro cell does. It's its own base station, so it has its own IP address and it's connected back into the core network directly.
Yeah, I would agree with everything that's said. I think some of the key attributes of a small cell is the equipment is small, the footprint is small, it's a low power transmitter, it's providing very targeted coverage and capacity. Could certainly be installed indoor or outdoor. Generically, I like to think of it as differentiated from a DAS, even though physically driving by it might look like the same type of thing. But to me, with DAS, the big difference is you're looking at a neutral host type of application where multiple carriers can use that same infrastructure, whereas kind of the pure small cell is probably dedicated to a single wireless carrier.
I would just add to all of the above that from the carrier's perspective, they want to see a small cell that costs less than $10,000 all in, right, up and on air, which I don't think the industry is certainly not there yet, right? I think we're probably closer to the 25, 30K range on a typical all-in installation and on air. So I think that small cell is, if you can get the cost down, that's going to really see, you know, a true small cell, right? Something that you can easily go plug in and it'll self-optimize and self-discover and, you know, do a lot of stuff. And if the site proves in, then you'll pull in something a little bit bigger with a higher wattage later on, you know, with the full range of backhaul and optimization.
So let's move on to backhaul, which is really at the core of what we're here to discuss. And I think one of the things that we hear in the market is we hear the term backhaul used in the same sentences with the word fronthaul. So maybe we could get another definition cleared up here. Bo, if you want to interject on the backhaul versus fronthaul side of things and just explain the differences that you see in the space today, or what the difference is.
Sure, thanks, Aaron. So fundamentally, backhaul's been used to provide a big pipe, typically from a macro site or a data center back to either another data center. Traditionally, backhauls come from what was either known in the industry as an MTSO or MSC, Mobile Switching Center, back into the PSTN. That evolved eventually as data systems were introduced. And so then you had to have some type of data gateway, so that data gateway back to the internet also had backhaul. But when you look at a small cell, you could consider that how it's connected back into the core network, because it's pure TCP/IP. It's just internet connectivity back to the internet. You could consider that backhaul as well. The big difference is when you're looking at remote radio units with baseband, and then they're connected, or that could be the basis for a CRAN network, that really you're not connecting back into a network. You're just connecting between a baseband unit and the remote radio unit. You're just separating the two. That's fronthaul. If you have a DAS optical repeater and it's connected back to a master optical unit that does the RF to optics conversion and then sends the signal back and forth between the optical repeater and vice versa, repeater back to the master equipment, that is also fronthaul. And those we think are the fundamental differences when, at least from a Crown standpoint, when we talk about backhaul versus fronthaul.
Okay, so let's discuss a number of the solutions that have been deployed. Maybe we'll start with Jeremy, and maybe you can talk about some of the unique things you guys have done, what you're looking at from an HFC perspective, and your position as a cable provider and leveraging your plant.
Thank you, Aaron. I think we've seen lots of different challenges as this is small cells matured and starting to figure out a lot of the issues that are, whether they're issues that the carrier needs to solve or things that the service provider needs to solve in order to get a cost-effective, timely solution in place for the carrier. Some of the things that Cox has been able to do is really to speed up and lower cost is leverage existing assets that we've got, whether it's the over 2 million poles that we have access to today in our footprint, or leveraging our strand and our HFC plant that has battery backed up power ready to supply services for that small cell. A lot of those things help take something that could be a year, cut it down to a 3-month install period, which is pretty, I think, revolutionary right now in this stage of the growth of small cell. And it's something that Cox has been able to do. And when we talk about trying to deliver the services, much of what we do today is fiber-based. But I think they'll be, depending on the solution and what the need is for the carrier, I think a hybrid fiber coax and DOCSIS delivered service can be very interesting because of the costs are lower. 3.1, DOCSIS 3.1 is really going to push the envelope on bandwidths to where you can see, up to 1 gig up and 10 gig down. And that is, you can't say that holds back any bandwidth utilization.
So, Steve, you come at it from the non-line of sight perspective, so maybe you can give us, we have a number of wired folks up here, maybe you can provide the sort of wireless perspective on what's going on in the backhaul space with small cell today and what your solution is.
Sure, I'll do so. Before, I want to make one more point on the CRAN, whether it's front haul or backhaul. I think one further distinction I would make is generally when I think about backhaul, I think about transmitting IP. Generally, we're in IP networks now. When I think about front haul, I think about carrying IQ data. So we're taking the connection, whether it be CPRI or some other based format, and connecting a radio head down to a baseband through this medium. Generally, when I think about that, I think about the data rates required on the front haul. It's probably on the order of 500 to 1,000x more data being transmitted over that relative to what we would do in IQ. But in terms of non-line site backhaul, that was the fundamental basis of what Tarana was founded around. And really the idea there is how do you connect point A to point B, whether it be for small cell backhaul or enterprise solutions, when there's major obstructions in the way. And those obstructions could be slow-moving, cars driving by. It could be long-term averaging where you have buildings coming and going. But the idea there is how do you provide a very robust 5-nines communication link between those two endpoints. And so Tarana was founded around this idea of multi-antenna signal processing, where we really leverage and harness the multipath that's inherent in these non-line of sight channels. And again, as those non-line of sight channels are changing. And what folks have done historically in non-line of sight is found, let's say, one dominant reflector, a building that they aim at, and they try to connect by aiming the two endpoints very rigorously to get that connection up. But what happens is over time that reflection changes. It can change when the wind blows or when it rains. The side of a building can change the reflection coefficient. What we have is a system that auto-adapts, at this point, 200 times a second to the change in environments. It makes it excellent for auto installation. You basically point in a general direction, the two endpoints connect. We connect at very high data rates. We're in non-line of sight channels, we're at 256 QAM or 1024 QAM. In a 20 megahertz channel, we're basically carrying more than 200 megabits per second. In 40 megahertz, we'll do 400 megabits per second across this channel. And the idea there is, how do you allow a carrier to leverage an existing footprint, whether it be a macro site that has either fiber or microwave backhaul there, and wirelessly connect down into the clutter to connect to a small cell. That small cell can go on the side of a building, on a rooftop, on a pole, where have you. But the non-line of sight backhaul gives you the flexibility to optimize your location for what you want in terms of coverage and capacity. And if you really have a non-line of sight link, you can make the assumption that you can get that capacity off the small cell back into the core in a fairly efficient, economical fashion.
Yeah. Sounds good. So Dave, Zayo has been an early pusher of dark fiber throughout the telco space and enabling a number of solutions at the tower as well as at all sorts of sites. Can you maybe talk us through the dark fiber backhaul side of things and that versus a lit solution and what you've seen evolve and what you guys are providing there?
Yeah, absolutely. We're seeing a lot of interest in dark fiber solutions to towers that already, I'm speaking macro towers right now, that already are served with lit fiber solutions, and really a couple of reasons for that. One is just the general bandwidth growth that's required on the back, to meet the RF demand and the cost structure of supporting that. Most lit solutions, you pay a higher monthly fee as the bandwidth increases. And the wireless carriers, they have, pretty much a fairly flat revenue structure from their customers' ARPU. They really can't afford to see the, backhaul costs escalate as bandwidth demand increases. So dark fiber allows them to basically, lock in a flat cost structure, put the equipment out there, light it themselves, and then manage that capacity themselves, however they see fit. Whether it's upgrading the optronics, oversubscribing, doing quality of service management on Ethernet. There's different tools that they can employ that frankly they wouldn't let a lit service provider employ for them. So that's number one, gives them a better cost structure and future-proofs their backhaul solution. Number two is the whole Fronthaul piece that was discussed earlier. Because of the high bandwidth requirements of SIPRI, generally anywhere from, let's say, 2 to 10 gigabits per second, depending upon which SIPRI scenario you're talking about, it pretty much requires dark fiber to transport that type of bandwidth. So as carriers start to look at evolving to a distributed or centralized RAN approach and requiring Fronthaul to towers within a cluster and aggregating that back to a hub, that also demands dark fiber. So if you think about that as kind of a future requirement and then architect a dark fiber solution that takes that into account, it gives them a good platform to grow the network.
And Bo, on your side of things, you guys obviously have a robust tower and site portfolio to go with what's becoming a deeper and deeper fiber network. So maybe discuss your solution and how you guys go to market on the backhaul side of things.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, we have now 17,000 miles of dark fiber. Some of that fiber does connect macros back to, or a backhaul scenario where it goes back to the PSTN or some type of data center. But the vast majority of the fiber is used to deploy small cells. That's really the nature of the business. As I mentioned previously, we view the fiber as a horizontal tower. So as long as you have a site that you want near anywhere, half a mile, quarter, tenth of a mile, is a no-brainer, and we can get it permitted, we could put a small cell there. Yeah. And from that standpoint, we're totally agnostic of what the technology is, what the equipment is. What we need is the equipment to be, and that's where we work a lot with the OEMs and the operators, getting them to understand that the equipment has to be what we call municipally friendly to allow it to be easily permitted. Otherwise, defeats the purpose of trying to deploy a small cell. There's also scenarios where we've now started to deploy small cells on towers at much lower heights, of course. And by that, it goes back to the broader definition of how we're defining small cells as a remote radio unit at a much smaller height.
So, Shaun, in your role in the industry, helping facilitate these deployments, I guess maybe give us a little perspective on where we are today. What's happened? What technologies have you seen most commonly used? Where have they been used? Where have they been successful? So where are we today, I guess?
So I'd say that the technologies are still under development. The carriers that we're working with are, actively working with the OEMs to develop, as you said, a municipal-friendly small cell, something that is plug and play as much as possible, right? So that it's pretty easy to put on a side of a building or rooftop or indoors, and is very versatile. On the backhaul side, we've seen stuff like a UE relay solution, which is, again, under development, but utilizing in-band spectrum that the carrier owns. And we've seen more non-line of sight type of stuff that's, also, very robust and gets you into a spot quickly. So I think again, the key around small cells is flexibility, right? If you can get something that you can get permitted quickly and easily and go stick somewhere to solve a customer problem, and then later come back and figure out if you need fiber or if you need to harden or you need to do something else to it, that's the whole goal, right? Something that's cheap, fast, and solves an immediate problem.
Yeah. So I think it would be great to get a perspective from each of you on both the vendor and carrier side of things, where you guys are today with regard to real deployments, where you've seen success, and we use the inning in baseball analogy all the time. So maybe give us what inning you think this space is in, and discuss where it's going from your entity's perspective. So Jeremy, you want to lead off?
Thank you, Aaron. Good analogy on the baseball. I'm this year is a tough year for me because I'm a Red Sox fan, so I'm in mourning this year because they're pretty poor. But hopefully there's some out there.
The Patriots kick off in a couple
That's
hours.
Right.
So
we'll wait for the Patriots. But I'm trying to think. It's definitely in the early stages of the game. We're definitely past the first pitch, and we're into the early stages. But I wouldn't say we're that far along. I think there's a lot more work to be done in this area. Just to getting to your other point on the deployments that we've seen so far, I think a few carriers are obviously further ahead than others, and we've been through the past couple of years on some trials. We've moved now to more full deployments, whether they're pole top or strand mount, and supporting lots of different indoor solutions as well, and those are more as a backhaul provider. But I am also meeting quite a bit with the OEMs, and you can see they've made quite a bit of progress over the past 2 to 3 years from something that we've installed some things that my network folks have affectionately called the Spaceship Enterprise, and that they're pretty large. They aren't really qualifying as a small cell. To now, I would say, the form factor and the stealth factor, as Shaun mentioned, they're really getting to something that I think is very deployable. And I'm excited overall for the industry. I think all of us have probably been waiting for that inflection point of when things are really going to start taking off. And I start to see the cost and the need those lines are starting to come together. And where the OEMs have something that really will work, that can be deployed, that the carriers like, and the service providers are getting better and more cost effective at delivering solutions at the same time. So I think things are, I'm optimistic about 2015 and 2016 as it grows next year.
sounds good.
Thank you. From the Tarana perspective, I think where we're seeing the most activity right now is in Europe and Southeast Asia. We are deployed commercially in several countries throughout Europe. When I think about 4G in Europe versus United States, Certainly, the United States was ahead and had to lead there, but I'm seeing more action right now in the European markets where they are deploying 4G small cells. And the issue there is, there isn't a rich fiber connectivity throughout the different nations. It's difficult to trench, through historical roads and buildings, and so we're seeing some great traction there. We've only announced one commercial deployment customer right now, and that's with Vodafone. So we did some good work with them over the last year and a half. But they're a good, strong customer. In the United States, I think all of us recognize there's been a lot of talk about small cells, carriers putting out broad numbers. But yet, I think to date, most of the deployments have been indoor small cells, called femtocells. On the outdoor side, I think there's basically one carrier in the United States doing C-RAN type architectures. But there is a lot of activity, at least on the backhaul side, around RFQs for small cells from virtually all the major carriers in the U.S. And I think, as you say, starting next year, I think we're going to see some really good traction. But until then, our focus is on the major carriers that are out of Europe and Southeast Asia.
So back to the baseball analogy, we're definitely in the early innings as far as we're concerned. As I mentioned, we've already deployed 14,000 sites. I will agree with some of the other panel members that some of the equipment has gotten smaller, but the reason it has, small cell specifically, and even a remote radio unit, only supports one operator. So even though that equipment has gotten a little smaller, what happens is because it can only support one operator and typically only one frequency. So if you're a Verizon and you want it, initially and if they wanted MIMO, it required 2 remote radio units just to support one frequency. So now at least the technology's evolved where one remote radio unit will support MIMO. But if you want 2 frequencies, that means still 2 remote radio units. What people forget then is then you need a power supply. Sometimes that power supply has to be accompanied by an AC-DC converter, and some people want battery backup, and you start having a very large cabinet that is not municipally friendly. And so it kind of defeated the purpose of the equipment getting smaller when you're trying to add on all this stuff and turning it into a telco cabinet that doesn't really lend itself to be mounted on a utility pole or a street light. So there's some clever solutions. We amongst others have deployed stealth poles to hide the equipment, but it's not inexpensive, and it still requires permitting and very specific requirements during the prototype stages, coming and working with the municipality to make sure that what you've developed, that could take several months to develop, and then if you want to go to volume, that it's exactly what they want. And it's not atypical when you're doing a 500 node project that maybe 70 to 80 of them are either ornamental poles or could be in historic districts. So you have to really design the equipment to fit in those areas. And what I think would move the business ahead to small cell deployment and lower the costs, if we could come some agreement on some of these pole designs and get people to understand what's a reasonable size shroud. Because we also believe that there is a place for both non-line of sight and line of sight microwave. But in any of these solutions, and now people are talking about 4x4 MIMO. So imagine 2 remote radio units for 2 frequencies, 4x4 MIMO. You got 8 coax going up to the antenna. You try to share that with somebody else. So you have 16 coax. You mean the coax itself is becoming the tower, right? And so, and let's even keep it simple where there's only like 4 coax, and then you're trying to put a microwave antenna on top and the equipment. Not very conducive and not very friendly to municipalities after you try to get all this stuff permitted, and those remain to be the hurdles, and that's why I still feel we're in the very early innings.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Bo. We're definitely in the early innings, and it does vary by carrier. Some of the carriers are out there doing full deployments, in the hundreds of locations, hundreds of small cells in a given market. Others are kind of maybe just, past the trial stage and maybe starting pilot deployments. So that varies by carrier. But in order to really ramp up and achieve, that slope that you showed at the beginning, Adam, over whether it's, whatever slope that has, it's going to be directly proportional to how much we can drive the cost down and how much we can standardize this and turn it into a cookie cutter. So the form factor, the equipment is definitely a huge piece of it. The other big piece is, and I'll maybe touch on this more later, but the permitting and the municipal approvals, really, we're in spring training in terms of getting the municipalities to understand this and buy into it and figure out what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, and turn it into something that can really be deployed quickly without a lot of pain, and they, the cities and the public will be happy with what gets built. So I think that's actually one of the biggest challenges we have to work through to enable scaling.
So we're hearing a lot of talk about different impediments to deployment. Maybe, Shaun, you could put in perspective, backhaul's an impediment from a cost perspective versus, everything else that we've heard here with regard to permitting, site zoning, all the different pieces that come into play.
Yeah, so I would say that the key, at least for us when we've been talking to the carriers, is they want a turnkey solution that literally they can say to somebody, hey, in this town center, I've got certain dead spots because of building density. I need for you to go solve those problems for me. Come back in 90 days and let me know that you've done it, right? So they don't, on a typical macro build, obviously your search rings are larger. They want 3 candidates, the whole thing, right? On a small cell, I think that they're really taking the opinion that says, hey, I only want to spend X number of dollars per site. I want to solve my coverage issue here. Go get it done, right? So the best way to do that, from, I think, handing it to a Crown or handing it to, pick your construction vendor, they're going to go with something that's small, that is a, 5 watt or less kind of device that they can, be very unobtrusive somewhere, and they're going to put up probably a, one aggregation point and then put some non-line of sight stuff that you can easily backhaul, move things around. Your cost structure is going to have to work within a 15K per site type of limit. And by that, you're going to define a lot of how you're going to actually do the deployment. Certainly Manhattan, Times Square, you're going to have some very extraordinary costs and structures, so that's out of the realm. But I think for most carriers, if you can move down to that price point, you'll see a significant volume increase. And I did want to echo kind of what you were saying, Steve, that Europe is a very different story around this stuff, right? They're just now really moving into a lot of the 4G arena, and fiber is really difficult, right? So, we're running into one case where literally the conduits are full, right? There's nothing left, right? So you're going to have to go figure out a very different solution there versus the U.S.
Yeah. So when you look at impediments today, is backhaul number one, or are there other things that would rank higher when you're helping carriers do deployments?
I think it's the ease of the deployment that's really the number one, right? Okay. Because again, they're trying to solve a very specific customer issue or a hole in the network between 2 macros because of an obstruction. And so they want somebody to just be able to say, yep, give me the 7 sites in Cincinnati, I'm going to go solve it. And then they don't want to go necessarily through traditional AV or the traditional, route on the backhaul as much as they want to just know that it's going to work within the current network structure.
Okay. So maybe if we talk backhaul economics a little bit here, I'd like to get the perspective from each of the panelists on, cost of solution and cost to serve, and how you guys compare. One of the things that we did in the process of building up for this panel was to look at the costs across a number of the different technologies out there. So maybe if we start on the fiber side of things, and Dave, maybe if you want to talk about fiber costs with regard to backhaul, and then we can kind of compare going forward here. Absolutely.
So, looking at the main driver of cost structure for fiber is construction. So the number one question is, how much network is there in the air and the ground today that you can leverage? Not that that has zero cost assigned to it, but it's sunk cost, and then you need to look at from there the incremental build you have to do to get to the placement of the site. And that's what really I think is going to drive the density of the sites is, where, and a lot of good news is a lot of cases there is fiber in the general area where there's people and traffic and the need for these, but that's not 100% true. And as you get further away, then the cost is going to increase. So we try to work with our customers and make them aware of where our network is in order to really because keeping our cost down is going to enable us to keep our price down to them in terms of picking the locations. So when you look at the traditional fiber to the tower, it was a different problem because the towers were already there. They were served by T1s, and it's a question of, what are my options to get there, who can get there cheapest, and eventually that played out over the years. Here you've got locations that haven't been specified yet. You've got, very small search rings. Maybe they're, 500 feet, a couple hundred feet in diameter. And you're trying to accomplish the usual things, the RF coverage, minimizing, all the costs, rent, if there's any rent associated with it, construction, and backhaul. So if that information about the fiber network is taken into account up front, it's going to lead toward a more optimal solution than coming up with the RF solution and then figuring out the backhaul later. Having said that, certainly there are locations where to get a cost-effective solution, it's probably going to require RF backhaul. Those are going to, but it's going to be backhaul to a place that has fiber, because sooner or later you have to dump all that bandwidth onto a macro cell or another small cell that's fiber fed. So they're definitely complementary, solutions, and I think the main thing is for the suppliers and the carriers to work together on optimizing that.
And Bo, do you have anything to add on the fiber side of things?
Not really. I think
Okay.
Dave summarized it well. I mean, we feel the same thing. That there's only one point I guess I would add is that the benefit of being the anchor tenant when we do build fiber, you get your first choice of the site. So even though we say, oh, okay, it's across the street or here, well, sometimes the difference of being across the street on a site will let you permit it 3 months faster. Because what happens is that you could be on a county line or a municipal line or a utility, and so that property line, if you will, makes a difference, where you're putting that fiber. So that's one thing. And then so as a result, the second operator coming on, that's really a lot of what we count on. Much again, when I'm using the tower analogy, is that once you build that fiber, you have that CapEx, that investment that you've made. You're really you're really looking for the second or third operators to come on to make the return worthwhile, much like you would with a tower, right? You don't build towers just to get one operator on. You don't build this fiber to get one operator on. The fiber is the shared asset.
So, yeah.
This is being recorded over the microphone, so if you could speak in the microphone so
Okay.
we can get on the recording, that'd be good.
Sounds good. So on the HFC side of things, Jeremy, can you talk about cable plant on the wired side of things and how that plays a role in this space from an economics perspective?
No, thank you, Aaron. And before I get into HFC, I think it was touched on earlier. The deployment and how ubiquitous your network is a big driver as to what the end cost is for the carrier. I would say it's one of the advantages that Cox leverages is that our networks are really 99% built. We have a lot of coverage, and if you add on top of that the hybrid fiber coax network, we really can cover almost everywhere with little build costs on top. I would say flexibility in the solution is really most important in the cost structure that you were mentioning, Aaron. And can we meet the need, because that need can vary. Is it a high bandwidth solution that they're looking for? Is it a high SLA reliability solution, or is it more of a smaller, low-cost option that is being looked for? If you don't have that ability to cover all of those options, I think it limits how flexible you can offer multiple solutions for the carriers, and they really need to have lots of options to fit the different needs and situations that they're in. One other thing I would add on, and we talked about it a little bit before with our hybrid fiber coax plan, is it is a powered network, and we do have battery backed up power sitting across that entire network, and it's easy for us to take reliable monitored power supply and feed that for the carrier to speed and lower cost for them. So I think it's a bundle of services. It's not just one in transport to really deliver a full solution.
Steve, do you want to take us through the economics on the non-line of sight and wireless solution side of things?
Sure, absolutely. I can't speak to the fiber side, but certainly if a carrier has access to a fiber at the location they want to use the small cell, it's advantageous to use it given the future proof of the fiber side. What we have heard, I think pretty consistently from the carrier partners that we're working with is they would like in the small cell side where there isn't fiber available to have the ability to go from that fiber pop, whether it be at the traditional macro site or some other location they're already getting service, they already have a bill there, they already have lit fiber. The incremental cost to add additional capacity is much less than to going out and getting a new fiber connectivity to a small cell or another location. So from a non-line of sight perspective, what they would like is a solution that will effectively guarantee them robust high-speed communication from that existing fiber lease point down into the clutter. And to the earlier point, I think the issue there is you need to design your network not around where you can get backhaul, but where you need the capacity. You need to put the small cell where it's optimum from a coverage perspective, from a capacity perspective, from a propagation perspective, and then have the assumption that you're going to be able to get backhaul there, whether it be wired or wireless. And again, from the Tarana perspective, what we've designed is a platform that effectively, in any dense urban area, we've done it in Manhattan, we've done it in cities in Europe, anywhere from a kilometer to 2 kilometers of true non-line of sight, 30, 40, 50 buildings in a way. We provide effectively 200 megabits per second and 20 megahertz. And I think that is a way for a carrier to control their costs, rather than having a continued operational cost for not only do you have your site rental, you have your power, but also if you have a fiber or some other connectivity point. Those costs tend to add up and go against the economics of a small cell, which again, people want to see being economically efficient. If you can take out that point where you've got a backhaul cost at that site that you have to pay on a monthly basis, of course you amortize capital equipment across however many years, 7 years a carrier wants to amortize that equipment. But the fact that you can actually leverage capacity from a macro site, carriers call a drain point for the small cell backhaul, is very, very efficient economically.
So I guess we'll pause for a second here and just see if we have any audience questions. We only have a couple of questions left here, but we're always happy to take questions from the audience. Okay. With that, we'll keep on moving along here. I guess from my perspective, we hear a lot of rumor in the ecosystem today in the U.S. around what Sprint does with their network and how they go forward and improve their network. There's a lot being staked on small cell with high band spectrum. And the importance of small cell or density. I guess maybe from each of your perspectives, I guess when we hear rumors of tens of thousands of small cells in a very tight time period, what do you think about from a backhaul perspective with regard to ability to deploy rapidly, in 18 to 36 months? Is it possible for an operator to go out and do that, or what will make it possible ultimately from a backhaul perspective and from an overall deployment perspective? So. Love to get the discussion going there.
Well, I'll start. I think from my perspective, you're looking at deploying 70,000 small cells over a very short period of time. There are a lot of issues involved there, right? And I think site acquisition is a big issue. I know they're working with various vendors to get that issue solved. Power. But my belief is, quite frankly, if you're going to do that type of deployment, the only way you're going to do it is in large scale is with wireless backhaul. We talk about in-band relay. I think you mentioned in-band relay earlier. I think it's an interesting solution. I don't think it's an adequate solution. I think the data rates associated with in-band backhaul are very limited. The latency is very high. I think you need a purpose-built solution on that backhaul in order to get the capacity off these small cells. If you're going to deploy 70,000 small cells, you want them because you're going to augment capacity. If you're at 2.6 gigahertz of spectrum, your propagation is very limited. Even at very high powers, 5 watts per channel or 5 watts per polarization, you're still pretty limited. But there's no value in putting out these 70,000 small cells if you can't get the capacity off of the small cell. So if you're going to put an in-band relay with 50 milliseconds of latency that's scheduled by another channel on another macro site, you're talking about data rates of, I don't know, 5 to 10 megabits per second. In my mind, you're better off putting another power amplifier on your macro site and blasting more power than to put out something with inadequate backhaul. Just the economics just don't make sense. So from our perspective, we're looking forward to those 70,000 rolling out.
Shaun.
Yeah, let me jump in. So some of the work that we've done specifically around the 70,000 plan is, the concentration is going to be in the right of way, at least that's the plan. And to Jeremy's point, right, that's where the cable guys are today, right? So they have both power and internet available now on a fiber basis. So it could be that, somebody like a Sprint will migrate relatively quickly from a UE relay play to I've got internet hanging above me, why am I not plugging in, right? And also looking at other non-line of sight solutions. So I do think that Sprint is unique in that they're focused really on the right-of-way space, which I don't think is typical of all of the other carriers in terms of where they're putting small cells, right? So, Sprint small cell is a 20-watt small cell, so it's kind of a medium cell versus a small cell. And I do think that their placement in terms of being able to get poles to with a muni-friendly and product. Using a UE relay is designed to be fast, but to Steve's point, I think once it's in operation, they may have to come back around and beef it up to make sure the capacity is really there.
Yeah. So, Dave and Bo, you guys have done a lot of these deployments over the past couple of years. Maybe lend your perspective on speed to market and how fast. Is it realistic? What's a realistic time frame to do something like that?
Yeah, I mean, 70,000 is a huge number, so that's very aggressive even in a 3-year period. But of course, you have to break that down into, okay, well, that's across, let's say 100 markets. So is that really, 700 per market? And break that down. What resources do I need to pull that off? I think the biggest challenges are going to be on the siting side of things, personally. Even if you focus on the right of way, you still have to get to the point where each jurisdiction, potentially power company, depending who owns the poles, allows you to put these installations in. Even if they're not opposed to it, they kind of have to get on board with the plan, and that can take quite a bit of time, a year or more to work out those arrangements. So that's something that has to get done. It's got to get done by the industry anyway, but to do it simultaneously across all large markets in that period is going to be a challenge. Some will go easier, some will be challenging. I think, yeah, I agree. If you were to really take that off the table and physically deploy them that quickly, it's definitely going to probably require a good chunk of wireless backhaul. But I think there will be challenges there from a capacity perspective over time, so that could be an interim step. It allows you to get at least a coverage and some decent bandwidth out there, but it's not going to be hundreds and hundreds of megabits per site. I think Sprint certainly does have access to 2.5 gigahertz spectrum from Clearwire, that if they want to tap into that and use that for the backhaul, that's a benefit that none of the other carriers have. But that spectrum's worth a lot of money, and it's certainly, I think it's more of any sub 3 gigahertz spectrum is more valuable on the access link to the user device than it is for backhaul. So you kind of got to be careful how much you tap into that. So it's a big. They're very optimistic what they're trying to pull off. But even if they go after a fraction of that, I think it's going to be enough to keep everybody here busy for quite a while.
So let me add to that. Number one, we'd love to do some of this for Sprint. So we're very happy to try to support the effort. I think from a practical standpoint, the permitting and just as a matter of point, the 14,000 sites, probably 95% of those are in the right of way, and that we've deployed, and it's not straightforward at all. You take a city like LA, which everybody goes, oh, it's a city. You do a deal with the city. Well, no, there's probably about 80 sub-municipalities that make up LA. So even if you have a deal with a utility in LA, it doesn't help you if you go into Compton, which has much stricter requirements than, say, even a place like Santa Monica. And so you need municipal agreements with each of those cities. So that's number one. Number two, if you come in a lot of these municipalities, everything's still done with paper. So it's just like any one of you, if you wanted to go add an addition to your house, and you say, well, I need a plumbing permit, I need an electrical permit, I need somebody to come out there and inspect it, it's the same thing. And imagine when you're ripping up the street to put in that fiber, and yes, there's a lot of aerial fiber, but you still got to rip up the street a lot of times to get that fiber in. Or even if you're not putting the fiber in, another solution, you're still having to get the permit to put it on the pole. Once you get the permit on the pole, I'm sure most of you have been around in this business long enough when you talk about backhaul in the old days of getting everything built and then waiting on Ma Bell to get the T1 to you, which could take months. Well, in the right-of-way world, that's the utility company, because you could have all the permitting and everything up on the pole, and you could be waiting 2 months for power. So that number of sites and that amount of time with the systems that are out there today, I do not see being practical at all. As you know, one major operator made a claim they were going to do 40,000 small cells a couple of years ago. So.
Jeremy?
So I agree, this is a monumental task, but I would tell you that if some of the carriers start thinking about things in I think a little bit different way, and that there is options that can probably help speed the process. A lot of it, if you are going to leverage right away, you're going to have to leverage existing assets and companies that have existing rights. And if you are trying to build new, that's going to take time. So I agree with Bo on that. The good news, I think, and I'll just speak to Cox and some of the MSOs, is we have a lot of existing rights. We have a lot of existing strong relationships with every municipality that we work in, and that's thousands. So Bo's right. One city can have 50 municipalities in them. But the good news is we work with those municipalities every day. And if you've got power, you have existing rights, you can probably help speed that along. It may not be the exact solution that a carrier may be looking for at the time, but you can get faster if you think about things in a little bit different way.
So with that, are there any questions before we close it up here? Okay. So I guess we'll give everyone one last word on, you know.
I think there was a question.
Oh, there was a question. Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to make a quick comment too. I'm with a municipality. I mentioned this yesterday, and I actually work a lot with Zayo, especially since they acquired ACI and the Twin Cities area too. But from a permitting perspective, one of the things we look at from a municipal thing is sometimes it's the lack of coordination to extend fiber to currently the macro sites. In particular, we have one tower that is in the middle of a park. It has 4 providers on there. So we have 4 construction companies, months apart, all running their separate fiber to that tower. So I think what it comes down to, when you look at the permitting, it comes down to, a lot of it becomes for public perspective, it's everybody's going to the same places, but they're all going at different rates and using different people, and it just becomes this permitting, we're overwhelmed with that whole permitting process. And now that we're going to like decorative screening and stamped concrete, you've got one guy that Verizon has a contract where the contractors, they'll get fiber. They're ripping up the streets, and 6 months later, another contractor's coming up, ripping up the same streets, and they're all going to the same tower. So it's one of those things that I just wanted to interject from a public perspective.
Sounds good. And I think with that, we'll close it out with, you know, each panelist giving a brief perspective on, you know, if we think about this space in 5 years, where are we going to be? Are we going to see real scale deployments over the next 5 years? It feels like we've been talking about it for 5 years, but have yet to see real traction. So, and what that will encumber. Okay.
Sure, I'll be brief. I think you will really start to see the numbers climb, and I think, Shaun, you're right. The costs have to come down for it to to hit the numbers and be a true solution for the carriers. And the solution providers that have the ability, maybe the embedded network and the cost advantages to get there, and hopefully some of the existing infrastructure and rights and power that can be leveraged to help lower those costs, are going to be the ones that can really help deliver the volumes that the carriers need to be successful in this area.
I agree. I think looking from where we are now, and we have, Tarana's been at this for commercialization of this product now for about 4 years, and the whole view is, small cell time is coming, the small cell time is coming. It really hadn't come here yet, and I hear that from our investors and from potential customers. But now, we are ripe in the market. I think the carriers are starting to move. We're seeing that now. They're spending money. They're making plans. There is now a solution set that's there available now from the access RAN to the backhaul side to the deployment architectures. I think all that now has come together, and we're optimistic. We're optimistic over the next 3 to 5 years there'll be significant deployments. Again, not only in the United States and Europe, but everywhere. We're seeing traction in many different markets right now. And we expect it to grow. And I think from a wireless perspective, if you've got a solution that solves the problem for the non-line of sight backhaul solution, I think that enables you actually to grow into different adjacent markets beyond just backhaul, but into access.
Yeah, so I think that over the last couple of years, even though we've talked about small cells, as Aaron, as you've mentioned, for 5 years now, those first couple of years, there really wasn't any products. And now these last couple of years, I think people have just now become educated enough and realize the challenges that you face when you're trying to deploy in the right of way. And indoors is a whole different game, right? But at least outdoors in the right of way, and when you're trying to densify a network, you've heard all the challenges that you face. So I like to think that this has been a big learning experience, and everybody's become educated on it. And hopefully in the next year, there is this cooperation between municipalities and trying to come up with more of a cookie-cutter approach when it comes to deploying some of these sites. And I anticipate by 2017, this market's going to start taking off.
Yeah, so I think that cell densification is inevitable. It's got to happen. It's the only way we're going to support the capacity that's, basically got no end in sight. And all of those locations are going to require still a lot of bandwidth. Even with the small cells, we're going to need to get up to gigabit per second or more per bandwidth to those over time. So that's all going to happen. How fast it happens is going to depend on how well the industry ecosystem can work together to drive down the cost and attack these hurdles that we just talked about. And so I think everybody's going to have to kind of come from their different perspective and make some compromises, including the wireless carriers, equipment vendors, fiber providers, municipalities, et cetera, and figure out how do we really address all those things, optimize them the best we can in order to allow us to open the floodgates. So, I was just analogy. It's going to happen. I was thinking going back to CTIA shows. I remember going to CTIA shows in literally like the mid-90s, and everyone was talking about wireless data, and it's like, what? This is never happening. What's all this data stuff? Eventually, texting came along, but it's here, and it's just a question of when. Whether it happens in 3 years or 5 years or 8 years, we're going to get to these giant numbers.
Yeah, I would echo that. I think the cell densification is a real thing that's going to have serious. I guess the driver is going to be things like driverless cars, as an example, right? And you're going to need a significant amount of densification of the current cell sites in order to make sure that you've covered everywhere, right? So you can't do that with a $300,000 or $500,000 macros. You're going to have to do that with $10,000 small cells that, to your point, will be, you're going to skinny it down, and maybe, battery backup won't be quite as much, et cetera, et cetera. But in the end of the day, they're going to still be supporting a gig of data because it's that much volume, that much traffic, and there's going to be one every quarter mile or half mile. And in order to get that kind of densification, you've got to look towards alternate solutions. Sprint's foray into this at a 70,000, I think even if they do half that or a quarter of that, it's enough to really spur the industry to get some real good development on the equipment side of things. And if out of it comes a $5,000 or $7,000 small cell that other carriers can take advantage of, I think it's good for the whole industry.
Sounds good. Thank you all, and we'll move on, and we have next up the macro site panel.